So once the Europeans get in there, this is kind of like a no-brainer, but European takeover here was often traumatic for the colonized people with the loss of life and property could be devastating. Again, nothing necessarily really that different than what we saw in the first round of colonization, with the exception that the loss of life here is not necessarily going to be coming from European born diseases. I mean, we have a little bit of that in some places, but the issue of measles and smallpox isn't necessarily one of those great population destroyers like it had been in the first round of colonialism. Because, guys, keep in mind, we're not really going after any place that is truly new. We will have some places that are isolated, and that isolation is going to cause problems with the indigenous population's immune system. But we're not going to have the devastating effects that we did in the first round of colonialism. Now, there will be some groups and individuals that cooperate willingly with their masters. They see that this is going to be an advantage to them. And you had these exact same types of people in the age of colonialism, during the age of discovery, that they see that there is some benefit they can get, that they can have employment in the armed forces and make quite a bit of money and also have some power, and elites are going to be far more willing to cooperate with the Europeans coming in, the Westerners in general coming in a hopes that if they cooperate, that will allow them to maintain their elite status. Governments and missionaries are also going to promote European education. With this, we end up getting a growth of a small class with Western education. And the government, as time goes on, is going to rely upon them to assist with governing. Although, you do want to put down here next to B underneath number two that this created problems. This created problems in the era rather, in the era of decolonization. In the era of decolonization. We're going to have a period of time immediately following World War II where these colonies that we're going to be building over the next two chapters are going to end up falling apart. And once that fall apart happens, there's going to be, in some cases, internal division. And one of the lines of division is going to be having these Western educated individuals that have received power during imperialism are not necessarily going to be very willing to let that go. So they'll be very pro European, while these other groups are going to be far more pro freedom. Now, we do see obviously some periodic rebellions. I mean, because we can't have trauma and loss of life and just general devastation without there being some people who are going to have some things to say about it. The biggest one here is going to be the Indian Rebellion that was based upon a series of grievances. You want to put down here next to A underneath number three, because there's another name for this that honestly I've seen more than it being titled the Indian Rebellion. But it's known, you want to put down that it's also known as the Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoy. Sepoy. And what's happening here? You want to put this here over on this side next to A through E underneath number three. Do you want to put, please, here that the British East India Company was quote unquote in charge of India, not the British government. They had become fairly corrupt, mistreated the Indians, and were culturally insensitive. So, what happens is the British East India Company is all about making money. So, they don't really give a toss about the happiness, the welfare, and the fairness of their governance within India. So, they're doing a bunch of different kind of shady things, like they have a group of Sikhs that are in the British Imperial Army. And part of the promise was is that these Sikhs are never going to have to um be posted away from home, that they'll always be serving locally, which is not going to be the case. You have the outlawing of the Hindu practice of sati, where widows will throw themselves and commit suicide by throwing themselves on their dead husband's burning funeral pyre. But the one that really kind of cheesed off everybody and got this mutiny that begins the Sepoy Rebellion is the British East India Company had a very specific way of loading their muskets. These were all muzzleloader muskets at this point. And what they end up doing, rather than individually packing all the constituent parts, they would have a paper cartridge, and what you would do is that you would rip off the top of the paper cartridge, put it in the barrel, and then you would ram it down the barrel with a ramrod. Well, the thing is that these cartridges had a little bit of lubricant on them, and it's going to be an animal fat. And it went back and forth to whether it was beef fat, whether it's cow fat, or whether it was pork fat. Well, Hindus aren't able to take in any fat, any animal products based upon their religious beliefs, but certainly not beef fat because cows are sacred. And Muslims obviously are not able to consume pork products. So it's this level of just shenanigans that really ends up cheesing off the sepoys, because the British East India Company forced them to, with their teeth, to rip off the top of these cartridges to activate them, thereby ingesting some of the believed animal fat. And this is just, a bridge too far, and they end up revolting against their British troops. Ultimately, this is going to lead the British government to assume direct control over India. So the British East India Company is no longer going to be in charge, and the British government is going to directly govern India. India will essentially be placed under crown control. Now, in these new colonial empires, and you're going to have to flip to get all of this, race was a prominent point in distinguishing rulers from the ruled. You want to put down here, once you flip to page 3, you want to put down here next to number 1. You want to put, please, here, before colonization, religion defined people. I mean, one of the defining features of old colonization, which is colonization in the New World, wasn't the color of people's skin, it was the religion that they practiced. So the Spanish and Portuguese are coming in as Catholics, and they're seeing the indigenous population not via the color of their skin, but the fact that they're non-Christians. Well, here, now, because social Darwinism is this ever important and growing idea, race is going to be more of a difference than it had been before. And it's going to be more of a difference than even religion will be. This is going to cause education for colonial subjects to be limited and emphasizing practical matters suitable for their primitive minds. Again, there's going to be this concept that will continue on here for quite some time in the European mind, that anyone who doesn't look like them, i.e., anyone that doesn't look like a slice of Wonder Bread, is inherently primitive and is inherently inferior. So things will need to be dumbed down, and because of their inferior status, they're never necessarily going to be able to completely and totally do what the Europeans are able to do. And even the best educated natives are going to rarely make it into the upper ranks of civil service. Although this is a little bit of a stretch. You want to put down here next to B underneath number 1, do you want to put that this was not necessarily true throughout this period in all colonies and with all Western powers. This was not necessarily true throughout this period in all colonies and with all Western powers. You will see some Western powers, in particular the English, who are going to use these Western educated Indians to help govern. And for some of them, they will achieve fairly high status. However, you're not going to see this in areas of Africa, for example. It's almost as though the Europeans have a different scaling of racism. And for them, the Africans are going to be at the bottom of the pile. The Indians, at least in the English mind, are going to be, just slightly better. Racism, of course, is going to be especially pronounced in areas with large numbers of settlers, of European settlers, like, for example, South Africa. You're going to see that they will actually have institutionalized racism with apartheid. Because of the fact that South Africa will actually be a legitimate settler colony. And these colonial states are going to impose deep changes in people's daily lives. Um, there were changes in people's daily lives with the first round of colonization from 1450 to 1750. Now, this more aggressive and more all consuming imperialism is just going to take that to another level. Gender is also going to play a role. Where colonizers took pride in active masculinity, that they are the conquerors, that they are the defeaters, that they are the women, sorry, that they are the winners, where they're going to define the colonized, the losers, as soft, passive, and feminine, that there is something inherently weak with them. They're going to pass on to them a lot of very feminine characteristics. And these colonial policies are going to contradict European core values and practices at home because essentially these colonies were dictatorships. You want to put down here next to A, underneath number 6, that at this time, Westerners were asking for more rights at home. At this time, Westerners were asking for more rights at home. It's going to be during this time that you have, for example, the working class in some of these European nations who are starting to ask for the right to vote or my more widespread right to vote. You're going to see the call for universal male suffrage, all the same while that you have Europeans going all over the world and depriving people of those same basic rights that white Europeans at home are demanding are a right of birth. You also have racial classifications going against Christian and Enlightenment ideas of human equality. And also, many of the colonizers were against spreading modernization to the colonies. Guys, you want to put down here next to D, because this is going to be a little relative, but put next to D on number 6 that this is to a certain extent, if it didn't benefit the mother country, then it wasn't done. This was to a certain extent. If it didn't benefit the mother country, then it wasn't done. Like, say, for example, telegraph or eventually later on telephone lines. If it wasn't of use to the Europeans to have telegraph, telephone lines, railway lines, or whatever else, then the Europeans aren't going to be investing in that and placing it within the colonies. However, if there was some advantage for, say, for these parts of Africa to have railway lines or to have telegraph lines, then the Europeans wholeheartedly are going to make sure those colonies get whatever it is that the Europeans can use.